In the darkness of night, under the twinkling cover of stars, the Northern California coastal road looped. The striped asphalt stretched like a black snake along the formidable cliffs that framed the ocean, foaming with white ridges. Inside the sports car, which cut through the darkness with its headlights, there was a cozy warmth and a slight tension. At the wheel sat Dan Merrick, a confident, trim architect, his eyes focused on the road, but with the glow of a recent dinner with his wife Judith. She was as dazzlingly beautiful as ever, with her thick brown hair framing her chiseled face, sitting beside him, her gaze sliding now and then over her husband's face, in which she read not only masculinity but also a certain underlying anxiety. They had just spent a pleasant evening, filled with laughter and talk about their future life, Dan's new career, their plans for a holiday, but the atmosphere had suddenly changed to one of anxiety, a slight irritation hanging in the air, caused by Judith's vague remarks about Dan's work and the fact that he was obviously more interested in his work than in spending time with her. Suddenly, as if out of the blue, on a winding stretch of road, the car's headlights illuminated a sudden obstacle, a car coming straight at them. The seconds slowed. Dan froze for a moment, instinctively trying to avoid the collision, turned the steering wheel sharply, but it was too late. The impact was deafening. The screech of metal and the crunch of glass filled the night, and Dan's consciousness faded like a candle flame in the wind. When Dan opened his eyes, he was like a newborn, unaware of anything around him. Pain throbbed in his head as if thousands of needles were piercing his brain, and everything around him was blurry and unnatural. He was lying in a white, sterile room, with machines whirring around him and a figure in a white doctor's coat leaning over him. He tried to remember what had happened, but his memory was like a torn cloth, with scraps of images and sensations, but without any consistency. The doctor, with sympathy in his voice, explained that Dan had been in a car accident, suffered severe head injuries, and as a result had amnesia. His face, disfigured by shards of glass, had to be reconstructed through plastic surgery. Dan could not remember his wife, Judith. He saw her in front of him, a beautiful and caring woman, but there was no response in him. His heart did not recognize her, which hurt Judith deeply. She tried to hide her pain, tried to show Dan her love and care, but he looked at her with the eyes of a stranger. He felt like he was in a cage, trapped in unfamiliar people and places. His past was hidden from him, and the present seemed to be constantly slipping away. He was disturbed by scraps of dreams, fragments of memories appearing in his head, but they didn't add up to a coherent picture, only causing anxiety and irritation. After a few weeks, Dan returned home, to a house that seemed unfamiliar to him. He wandered the rooms, looking at the furniture, the paintings, the photographs, but nothing resonated with his soul. It all seemed foreign and unfamiliar. Judith tried to ease his return. She showed him old photographs, told him about their life together, tried to awaken his memories, but in vain. Dan felt like an actor playing a part he didn't understand, saying words that made no sense to him, but he felt that he had friends, people who came to their homes, with whom he exchanged meaningless phrases, but they were all strangers, did not inspire his trust. A special place among these people was occupied by Jack Staten, a close friend of Dan's with whom he worked and whose presence, for some reason, caused Dan discomfort and irritation. Jack was always around, trying to appear friendly, but his eyes sometimes flashed with hidden anxiety. Dan felt as if he were on a stage, under the scrutiny of others, all of whom knew his past but were in no hurry to tell him the truth. He began to notice oddities, scraps of unspoken phrases, suspicious glances, and a vague feeling grew in him that something was wrong. One night, he was plagued by nightmares, vague images of disaster, scraps of conversation, and a voice shouting his name. He woke up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding like a caged bird. Judith, concerned about his condition, came up to him, but he couldn't say anything to her. The words stuck in his throat. He felt like he was trapped. Gradually, he began to realize that his amnesia wasn't just forgetting. It was like a wall built by someone to hide the truth from him. He began to suspect that something had happened that night, something that they wanted to hide from him, and that maybe he wasn't just the victim of an accident. In one of his visions, he saw himself surrounded by police officers, and he thought one of them was looking at him with a sinister smirk. He couldn't understand what it could mean, but the vision made him wonder. He started digging into the past, picking up bits and pieces of information, visiting places he thought might be familiar to him. He found an old newspaper in his office with an article about a tragedy, but his name was not mentioned, only the collision of two cars and the man who had died in the accident. This discovery raised even more questions in him. He began to notice that Judith was often lying or understating things, that Jack, instead of being supportive, showed a strange curiosity, and he began to realize that his surroundings were not what they seemed. He began to conduct his own investigation, trying to be discreet. He went through old papers, records, photographs, trying to find clues to solve the mystery. He learned that there was another person in the car with them that night, a person no one had talked about, a person they were trying to cut out of their lives. But why? During his investigation, Dan met Gus, a former police officer who had been fired from the force for his not-so-legal actions. Gus was a man with a troubled past and his own cockroaches, but he was immediately drawn to this mysterious case. He was the only person Dan began to trust, and he began to help Dan in his search for the truth. Gus, through his connections, began digging into Dan's past, and they discovered that Dan had many enemies, his business had many dark dealings, and that his life was by no means as serene as it seemed. In the course of his investigation, Dan begins to remember fragments of the past, not only the good but also the bad. He begins to realize that his life has been full of deceit and betrayal. He realizes that he is not as innocent as he thought he was, and that his past may be the cause of all his troubles. He remembers that he was cruel, ambitious, and that he was willing to go to his head to achieve his goals. He realizes that he was in love with another woman, whom he had forgotten about due to amnesia, and that Judith was not just his wife but a partner in his dark deeds. One day, Dan and Gus decide to go to the scene of the accident to try to reconstruct a picture of what happened. At the scene of the accident, they found a headlight shard, not from their car, but from another car, and this became the key to solving the mystery for them. They discovered that the collision had been faked, and that they had been the target of a murder. Soon after, Judith was kidnapped, and Dan realized that he was trapped, that his past had caught up with him, and that he had to act to save his wife. He had to remember everything to protect himself and the people he loved. He finally realized that the person who wanted to kill them was none other than his closest friend Jack, who had always been annoyed by his successful career. The final scene played out in an old abandoned building that once belonged to Dan's father. Dan and Jack found themselves in a deadly fight. Dan was able to defeat Jack using his skills from the past, which he, thanks to his growing memories, was finally able to recall. Judith was saved, but she was no longer the loving wife she used to be. She was exposed, and her true nature was revealed to Dan in all its glory. Eventually, Dan realizes that the only person he can trust is himself. He realized that his life had turned upside down and that he would never be the same. His past was complex, confusing, and dark, and he had to learn to live with it. He realized that amnesia had not only stolen his memory, but had given him a chance to start his life again, a chance to become a different person, a more honest and real person.